Chapter 31. The Bridge. The fourth level. Dread's Keep.
Ander, what are you talking about?
Malinka shouted as she stepped up alongside Krynen. Their shoulders brushed against each other, and her voice had taken on a diplomatic tone.
Hey, it's us. Are you okay?
Ander stood in place, his arms at his sides and his hands clenched into fists. He stared down at the ground beneath him, and his shoulders slightly rose and fell from his steady breathing. But he did not reply. Instead, the Vampire merely grinned to himself, lost in a series of thoughts that Krynen and Malinka were oblivious to. "Ander," Krynen finally said after a few moments of eerie silence. "Hey, you gotta say something. You're being fucking weird." Ander looked up and stared at Krynen. The look of amusement had not left his face, and his eyes seemed to grow brighter as he formulated his response. "I see it in you, child." Ander's voice should have been a whisper, but the power behind it seemed to swarm Krynen. It surrounded him, came at him from all sides, and finally coalesced into his ears. "The expanse, the data within you. Truly a wonder you must be that you have been entrusted with the secrets of an entire era. Oh, how one would be so lucky to sample that information, to dive within the pool of knowledge that has been thrust upon you, to take it, to use it." Krynen looked over at Malinka, and his face twisted with confusion. She shrugged her shoulders, and they both took a cautious step forward. Ander gasped at their unexpected movement and snapped his hand out. The two of them were suddenly pummeled by an unseen force and were both thrown backward into the moist stone walls behind them. Krynen's body slammed against the hard surface, and he could have sworn his spine had snapped in two. Malinka let out a shriek as she fell to the wet floor, and Krynen forewent his own pain and scurried over to her. "The realms of the world that breathed the first breaths into our lungs yearns for deliverance." Ander's booming whisper swirled around Malinka and Krynen, blowing their hair in all directions, sending goosebumps over their arms. "And I, he who delivers, shall bring it unto them. Chains are meant to hold, they are meant to restrain, but so too are they a test of strength, a trial of will. I am to empower those who are bound by the chains of Govia, the links of ascent which hinder these souls who seek only to live until they can no longer. They are the culmination of the ages, those who are the fruits of evolution, ripe for the picking. They are Dura's children by nature, but I will liberate them. Yes, for once we break free from our literal prison, we shall march forth upon the mortal realm together and deliver unto the world a resurgence the likes of which they have never seen. The nativity of the people is nigh, and I speak their reborn names as one. They will be a people united, a collective of power and potential. Yes, they shall be the children of Eon, and I shall be their father." "Okay, we need to go," Krynen whispered to Malinka as they both got to their feet. "Anders lost his fucking mind." "Be not mistaken," Ander cried out to them, his voice cracking under the weight of the seeming desperation that amplified his words. "For at my right hand you shall be. Fret not, for together we shall bring unity unto the realm of the living, a harmony that will ensure everlasting life and unending growth. Our deliverance doth mark the dawning of a new era, the rebirth of Eon. Yes, the age of Eon is upon us." Eon. Krynen knew the name. Eon the Calamity, as he was called back on Duran. He lived nearly a century prior and had caused a great deal of trouble. Supreme Commander Zion Phoenix of Black Knight killed him back then. "Yeah, come on." Krynen grabbed Malinka's wrist, and he pulled her toward the only exit he could see in the room. The two stumbled forward, their feet slipping against the wet and slimy tiles beneath them. They finally found traction and scampered forward through the doorframe, leaving Ander alone with his ranting.
What in the hells was that?
Malinka shouted as she and Krynen emerged into a long corridor with tall, arched ceilings. Krynen paused for a moment, tugging on Malinka's wrists. In the light of the torches that lined the walls, he saw hooded anthropoid forms kneeling with their heads lowered and arms raised through the length of the hallway. They chanted with a throaty tone in a language he didn't recognize. Malinka turned and looked at him, fear apparent in her eyes. Crinan took in a breath through his nostrils and nodded. He slipped his palm down her wrist and interlocked their fingers, compelling them both to move forward.
How is this better than Ander?
Malinka sharply whispered as the two briskly walked past the hooded figures.
There's so many of them.
We can't go back, Crinan replied, gently tugging on her hand. We have to go forward. We have to get out of this castle and to the next level. As they walked, the corridor seemed to grow more and more narrow. The chanting grew louder, and the movements of the hooded ones grew more and more animated. They raised their hands into the air and then pressed their palms against the ground as their words grew louder. Crinan could feel the harmony of their voices vibrating in his chest, and as the walls drew closer and closer to him and Malinka, he began to feel helplessness overtake him. It's so hard, he thought aloud. Malinka squeezed his hand when his feet momentarily stopped moving forward. She turned toward him, and he looked to her. Seeing the expression of urgency that had been on her face was replaced with one of sympathy. She let go of his hand and placed her hands on his shoulder, gripping tightly.
Hey!
She sharply whispered, moving her head so that her eyes were locked with his.
We're going to get through this, Crinan. Do you hear me?
A cold sweat ran down Crinan's back, and he began to breathe rapidly. His heart pounded, and his head began to feel like it was floating. He heard what could only be described as an echo of screaming in his mind. The words were unintelligible, but he knew they were directed at his core. He felt like his very soul was under attack.
Crinan!
Malinka shouted. Her own words were frantic as, without even moving, the walls were closing in on them. The hooded figures were now reaching for the two of them, their gnarled, nailed gray fingers stretching to take hold and dig into them.
Crinan, it's okay,
Malinka urged.
This is a test. It is a challenge. We have to be strong. We have to fight through it.
How do you know? Crinan shouted, his words laced with sobbing and dread. How can you know? Malinka slid her hands past Crinan's shoulders, and she pressed her palms against his back. She pulled him into her and squeezed tightly. He buried his face into her neck, and her fingers migrated up to his head. He could hear her heart pounding as she gently pet his hair.
I just know, Crinan.
Malinka pressed her lips against Crinan's head as she whispered.
I know you're strong. I know we've got this far. We can't give in to the fear now. You can't give in.
Her voice broke as tears started to fall down her face.
I need you.
Crinan gasped. He had heard those words before. He had lived those words before. He sniffled and lifted his head from Malinka's neck as he pulled back and looked into her eyes. Malinka stared at him with a pleading look of desperation, but Crinan saw more. She looked afraid. She looked like she was giving everything she had to stay strong, but she also looked at Crinan with an expression of pure, unquestionable faith. Thoughts poured into Crinan's mind. First, he heard the words of Karsten from what seemed like a lifetime ago back in Syncroft.
I suppose one day you'll grow up a little and start acting your age. Maybe when you find something that's important to you.
Crinan reflected on those words. Was that really how people saw him? Immature, lost, stupid? He clenched his teeth together as another memory surfaced. Crinan, I'll be bold. Malinka wants you to step up in some way, whatever that may mean. She has expectations of you, an image of you in her head, and you are failing to meet that image. These were Ander's words. Ander before he succumbed to whatever madness had taken him. He looked deeply into Malinka's eyes. He saw her nostrils flare with her heavy breathing, watched her lower lip quiver with fear that she was trying so hard to keep at bay. What did Malinka see when she looked at him? Did she see what Karsten saw? What Ander saw? What everyone else saw? If that gal sees something in you, then she knows you can do better. For your own sake, deliver on her expectations. She didn't. Krynen took in a surprised breath at his revelation. Malinka saw something more inside Krynen, something that wasn't just hopeful thoughts. Her gaze pierced his chest and bored deeply into his heart. A realization much louder than the hopelessness that was weighing him down came to the front of his mind. Malinka, despite all the years he had let her down, despite all the pain he had put her through, believed in him. She saw the real Krynen, not the one he realized he wanted everyone else to see, but the one he protected. She believed in him. She knew he could do better. She knew he was better. "I need you too," Krynen blurted. He placed a hand on each of Malinka's cheeks and leaned in so that their eyes were only about half a foot apart from each other. "I get it," he whispered sincerely. "I understand. I finally understand what you see." At that, he gently leaned forward and pressed their foreheads together for a moment, and then his hand found hers again. Steeling himself, he locked their fingers together once again, turned, and stepped forward. The walls continued to close in on them. The hooded ones were now on their feet and reaching their long, bony fingers out toward Krynen and Malinka. Krynen, however, stood tall. His chin was raised, and he looked beyond those that reached for him. Ahead of him, he watched as a door on the opposite end of the hall started glowing with a blue light. He reached for his sword, and the chanting of the hooded ones halted for a split second. Krynen's fingers brushed against the hilt of his weapon, but then he pulled his hand away. "No," he whispered. "No, I don't need that." He took another step forward, pulling Malinka behind him. "We do this together," he called back, only loud enough so that Malinka could hear. A strong wind suddenly buffeted Krynen and threw him off balance. He stumbled back a few steps, crashing into Malinka, and they both fell to the ground. The hooded ones reached for him, and he looked up to see their long gray faces staring down at him. They looked like melted clay, misshapen and hideous. He watched their chins drop and their mouths open, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. "Hold on to me!" Krynen growled as he squeezed Malinka's hand tighter. The howling of the wind blasting past him nearly drowned out his voice. He felt Malinka clamp her fingers around his hand, though, and knew she was with him. The gale continued to push against Krynen as he got back to his feet, but he refused to let it dominate him. He found his footing, straightened his back, and with every muscle in his body strained, he reached his free hand out in direct opposition of the wind that was trying so hard to stop him from advancing. To Krynen's amazement, the wind seemed to part when it met his hand. He watched the wind blast against the hooded ones, sending them flying back to where Krynen had originally come from. He heard their screams, watched as their robes fluttered violently, and witnessed a few being ripped apart. With renewed confidence and vigor, Krynen stepped forward. Every step felt like an entire life's worth of effort to the Black Knight, but each time his foot landed against the floor, his desire to reach the door grew. He could feel what was left of the armor he was wearing rattling and shaking free, flying back to join the hooded ones behind him. He squeezed Malinka's hand, pulling her with him, resolved to never let go. He would not get to the door without her. He wouldn't even think of it. This was no longer just his journey. It was their journey, and this time he would finish it at her side. "Almost there!" Krynen shouted back to Malinka. The wind was howling and growing stronger with every step. Krynen's armor was all but gone, and his clothes flapped as the air passed through the folds of the fabric. The skin on his face had turned red from being buffeted by the small rocks and debris that the wind had kicked up. Blood ran from his dried-out nostrils. His eyes were red because they held no moisture, and his entire body throbbed in pain from fighting whatever force tried to hold him back. Krynen, however, would not stop. He pulled Malinka along, shielding her from the wind, and finally reached his free hand out, placing it upon the glowing door. "We're here!" Krynen yelled back at her. "Come on!" He pulled her up next to him so that they both stood in front of the door. The blue light that the door gave off shone on Krynen and Malinka's bodies as they both reached their weary hands out and pressed against the wood. "Push!" Krynen shouted. They both pushed against the door, and it moved, but only inches. More, Krynen instructed. It's heavy!
No shit!
Malenka grunted as she shoved her shoulder against the door. Krynen spun around and drove his back into the door, pushing with his legs, but for a moment he hesitated. Standing a few dozen or so feet behind them was Ander. His arms were held out to his sides and his palms were exposed. The wind didn't seem to faze him as he gently and casually glided toward them. "Fear me not, child," Ander called out, his voice mightier than the howling wind. "Redemption will be found through me. I will deliver it unto you." "Brothers, damn it, I'll push the fucking door, Malenka!" Krynen shouted as he pushed against the door harder. Finally, he felt it move more and more, and just as Krynen lost his balance and fell backward, Ander reached out and grabbed the collar of his shirt. "This was all predetermined, Krynen," Ander whispered as he pulled him in close. "We were meant to meet here. I was destined to put you on the right path. Through me, and only through me, will you thrive." "Fuck off!" Krynen shouted as he tried to wriggle free. Ander only tilted his head in response. He slowly raised his free hand, fully extending his fingers, and placed his palm upon Krynen's forehead. "That which has been so safely stored within your mind," Ander whispered. "The very knowledge entrusted to you by the fallen hero of our people, the greatest disappointment of my time. That is what you will now share with me." "What are you talking about?" Krynen hissed. I don't even fucking—"
Let him go!
A voice behind Krynen cried out. He felt something pull his revolver free from its holster and then heard a bullet discharge from next to his ear. Krynen cursed and Ander released his grip as he took a step backward. Blood was pooling at the center of his chest and a look of confusion spread across his face. Malenka reached out and grabbed the back of Krynen's shirt with her free hand and pulled him through the door. The two of them fell to the floor behind them, and as they both worked to close the door, they watched as Ander simply stood there and stared at them.